Hi everyone, my name is Marissa Sundberg,
And I'm Tori Biesinger.
and we are presenting to you our Action Research Project. This is known as the ARP in the School of Education, and it is a project focused on analyzing data across a unit and those 8 sections. The first part is the context of learning. This focuses on discussing what the population is of the school and the specific class that is receiving the instruction on this unit. Here is a chart that was included in the context of learning, just a snapshot of a few of the students in the class that we taught. So we have the gender of the student, the race of the student, and if they are on any individualized learning plans or on a speech plans or anything of those, what their scores were on state tests, the MAP tests, if they're scoring high or low, or if they're scoring average, that helps determine what groups we need to put them in to best differentiate the instruction.
The next part is the unit rationale, and this is a small section, but it describes the importance of the unit that is being taught and how that unit then fits into the rest of your instruction throughout the year.
The next section is the Colorado Academic Standards and Learner Objectives. This section focuses on the key points of instruction that follow the Colorado state standards. So these standards are a requirement for all teachers to teach their students, and it explains clear expectations that the students need to have completed in order to graduate to the next grade or move on to the next grade. So it gives teachers and students clear expectations on what needs to be taught or learned in each grade.
The next section is the pre or post assessment instrument and pre assessment data. So, instrument would be that test that we give to the students in order to see where they are, what areas the students are confident and comfortable, and what areas we might need to give more direct instruction in. Through doing this instrument, we're able to gather pre-assessment data, which we'll show you in a couple of slides. We'll show you some of that data of how the students do at the beginning, and then we're able to compare that at how the students do in the end of the unit.
So the methodology rationale is basically explaining how are we going to do this teaching? How are we going to analyze the data? So this methodology takes in a lot of research-based methods to determine how we're going to teach the students in our class. So 2 of the largest ones that we used while teaching this unit was gradual release, which is moving of responsibility. So at the beginning of a unit, at the beginning of a lesson, there's a lot of responsibility on the teacher, a lot of direct instruction, and throughout the unit, more responsibility is given to the students so they can begin learning more independently and practicing that on their own. And professional learning communities is the second one, and this is just a makeup of all the other 5th grade teachers that taught with us and the instructional coach of the school. And we looked at daily lesson plans, daily assessments to determine how to best differentiate and how to best teach the students to best help them succeed.
So, what we've looked at so far is a pretty big and wide look at a unit plan. Then we pull into a more in depth daily lesson plans and reflection. So, whereas we see the pre and the post assessment, well, how are we going to get the students from the beginning start A to the ending of point B? That's where our daily lesson plans and reflections come in. We'll show you a little bit more on this, but this is when we as educators and teachers see what areas the students might need more help, how we can differentiate the instruction for diverse learners or students with special needs, and what we can do ultimately to give growth to every single student and get them to a place in the end of a lot more confidence in the subject area that is taught.
Our post-assessment data and results, Tori touched on this earlier with the pre and post-assessment instruction. So this involves, again, the same assessment that we gave at the very beginning of the unit, and they take the test again, and then we analyze those scores. So we look at how they performed on the pre-assessment compared to how they performed on the post-assessment, and then we analyze the data and come up with an outcome of how many students learned, what was their growth, And again, looking back at the methodology on how did we do it, but mostly analyzing the growth, and we're going to touch on that more as we go throughout this presentation.
And finally, in the end, we come to interpretation and reflection. This is the point where we, as educators, can look and see what areas worked really well in this unit, what things did I do that really helped, and what were some areas that I need to change, reflect on, or grow from for future lessons or future classes that I teach. We do this in a cool way. We call it retain, refine, replace. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's basically coming to the idea of how can I grow as a teacher, because there's always that space to grow.
Okay, so for this unit that we taught fifth grade, as we've mentioned before, and the unit was Unit 5 on dividing decimals. The specific class that we were looking at today involved 20 students. 3 of those students were on a free and reduced lunch plan. This basically means that their families were in a low enough income bracket that the state had decided to help support those families by providing either free lunches or lunches at a reduced price. So the significance of that is because sometimes students in lower incomes can perform differently than students in an average income bracket, and we wanted to analyze that data. And then we also had 2 students on an IEP or 504 plan. IEP stands for Individualized Education Plan. So this is basically just a specific plan created for that student. So some students might be on an IEP if they are significantly behind and they need extra support. Sometimes students who are another language speaker as their native language, they might be on an IEP if they're behind in the specific language, as in English. So if they're a Spanish speaker, they might be on a plan for reading and writing. They might be behind in that or whatever. So we have 2 students in the class that we are analyzing today who are on one of these individualized plans. On the right, you can see our pre-assessment. This is the same assessment that they used for their post also. And there's multiple different higher level thinking skills on this test. So some of them, they just have to do the simple operation, but some, the word problems at the bottom, they do have to think and apply what they learned about dividing decimals and actually put it into practice.
Here we have our pre-assessment data. So this would be from the instrument, that pre-assessment that Marissa just explained to us, that we use in order to see where the students at before we even begin to plan the unit. It's actually called backwards planning. And by this way of doing our pre-assessment first, we're able to see what area do students need extra help in and what areas are we going to need to put more focus on, or what do they already know and are they already confident in. So we're able to see growth by charting down our pre-assessment data, and you'll see later on in our slides the post-assessment compared to the pre, that same test, and we'll be able to see the difference of how much did the student learning grow and where can we retain, refine, replace from seeing that growth and looking at that data. So this is just our start data. I know looking at it right now, it doesn't look like very good grades or very good scores, but that is to be expected because this normally would be an assessment on something the students haven't yet learned. And therefore then in a matter of weeks, we can see how much learning and growing was applied in that time.
And I do want to note that some of these do not have a graph on them underneath the number or above the number. And that is not because the student didn't take it, it's because they did receive zeros on the test. So that does show you that students did not have much prior knowledge before we began this unit. So specifically looking at our daily lesson plans. So as Tori said at the beginning, we're very wide scope, thinking about the pre and post test, what will they learn altogether. But then daily lesson plans gets really narrow, looking at specifically what are we going to teach each day. So we had a daily lesson plan created for every single day that we taught this unit. There's a very scripted, not always scripted, but it's a detailed script written out of what basically we would say, what is involved, how are we going to use gradual release, give the students more responsibility throughout each lesson. As you can see here, there's also the standards specifically mentioned, so we know that what we are teaching aligns with what is expected of us to teach in the state of Colorado. It also gives a clear objective. This clear objective is also stated to the students, giving them a target on what they need to learn and how they're going to be successful, how they will know when they have reached that target. So then the students know when they are completing it correctly and how they'll, instead of just having a big test at the end to know if they succeed, they can know if they succeed every single day, which helps them gain more confidence. It also shows how we're going to differentiate. Differentiation is a huge importance in teaching because not all students are at the same level, as you could see from our pre-tests. Some students came in with a lot of prior knowledge while others did not. And differentiate helps us to be able to reach all students and make sure they're all reaching growth of some sort. In the center, we have a picture of some of the formatives or the post assessments that we give the students. So at the end of almost every lesson, we would give a post assessment. And this assessment we often call ticket out the door. So we give them one problem focused on what we taught them that day, and they would all complete the problem completely on their own and then stick it to the door. And we would analyze that data later to determine what students understood what was taught that day and what students need more assistance, and maybe we would pull them to small group the next day, things like that. One more thing, retain, refine, replace. Tori already mentioned this, but going in a little more detail. Retain is what we want to keep. So if something went really well that day while we were teaching the lesson, we might say, oh, I really liked how we did this. I want to do it again the next day. So we did have a lot of the similar things that we used throughout our lesson plans. Refine is something that we like, but we wanted to edit it a little bit. So sometimes, for specifically with me, when I was giving a formative, I changed my mind on what it would need to be because I thought the numbers were too difficult. It was testing different things than what I wanted to test, things like that, little tweaks. And replace, self-explanatory, what we want to get rid of, what we want to do differently. Tori, do you have anything else to add about retain, refine, replace?
That sounds good to me. I think the cool thing about it is you can do it on a large scope, retain, refine, replace for the unit as a teacher, or you can look at it day by day, like what Marissa was hitting on with those exit tickets or those post assessments. What did we do well? What can we work on? And what can we replace? So yeah, I think that's awesome. Then on this slide, it is our post-assessment data. So before I explained the pre-assessment and you saw how those scores were low, even some of them were at 0, now we're able to do the same graphs that we'll go into more detail with and show the difference in our post-assessment data and what we gathered from before and after. This is the really exciting part as an educator, is to see, exciting and sometimes nerve-wracking, to see that growth in the student from the beginning of the unit, same assessment, to the end of the unit, same assessment. So on this first one, we took our scores from, as you can see, the pre-test scores, free and reduced lunch, which Marissa explained, those students who are lower income families judged by the state. And we wanted to see, is there a difference in their scoring? And so here, those students are marked out as blue, and you can see in the pre-assessment score, they're pretty much where all the other students are. We're in between 0. We have one outlier, number 7. This student scored a little bit higher on their pre-assessment, so we can see even at this point where we might differentiate his score or differentiate his learning in order to have a different outcome as we go. On our post-assessment, you can look at the next graph to the right. Those are the scores that the students received at the very end of the unit. Here we're able to see that our free and reduced lunch students, they look like they're falling at a pretty average pace with the rest of the class. It's not too far off. So by this, we're able to judge by this data that we bring together, we're able to see that the students weren't affected by being free and reduced.
At least in this unit, that is what the conclusion we've come to.
Yes, thank you. And then our IEP 504 pre-test scores are right here, and this is where our IEP or 504 students, which Marissa explained earlier, we have marked in blue. So as you can see in the pre-assessment, we have a couple zeros. 15 got a little bit higher on that one. And then our post-assessment, they did make growth. And so I think that that is a celebration in itself. Although they do look like they might be lower than the rest of the class as an average whole in this unit, they still made growth. And so that's one thing as teachers that we can really be excited about, is that there's growth there. So we're able to see what differentiated instruction did we use in order to build that growth, and what can we do differently next time? What problems did they still struggle with, and how can we replace or refine or change those in order to help my students next year in this same unit? Oh, and this is the most exciting slide.
This is so exciting. So as you can see, the pre and post data is analyzed side by side in this graph, which I think just shows how much they grew. And this is so much to celebrate as a teacher, because so many of these students had zeros or below, like 40%, I think is roughly the average that the students received on their pretest. But as you can see, a lot of them, we had 5 students even get 100%, which I think is so much to celebrate. And this is the reason why so many teachers teach, I think, because you're able to see their growth. And looking at this data, doing all this research allows us to actually see this. And if we didn't take a pretest, if we didn't analyze what we were doing, this wouldn't mean as much. But because we paid so close attention to the methods that we were using, the strategies of how we were teaching, how we were differentiating, this carries so much more weight because we know it was all purposeful. So overall, they all made tremendous growth. As Tori mentioned, number 7 is sort of an outlier. He has a lot of previous knowledge, so he still got a 70% on his pretest, which is what we shoot for all students on their post test. But he did make growth and he received 100%. But he, along with a few other students, we did push up to do some 6th grade math as well. And that was our way of differentiating for the higher kids, you might say. So going off of that, looking at our pre and post and side by side, there are some conclusions that we can draw, and this is what the interpretation and reflection really focuses on, is what did we do well? What do we need to keep? What do we need to implement in the next year of teaching, even in the next unit of teaching, etc.? So some of the strategies or the methods that we found to be very helpful throughout teaching this unit is gradual release. As we talked about before, this is pushing responsibility from the teacher to the student. So then when the students carry more responsibility of their learning, they often learn more, retain more information, and you can really see where they are. Classroom discussion. John Hattie is a researcher, famous in the education world, and one of his research methods is classroom discussion, and this is just turn-in talks or working with your table group or anything like that. And this allows students to bounce ideas off of each other to determine to better help themselves understand, because sometimes they might not understand teacher language. But if one student understands and then a whole group does a problem together, the other students in that group might be able to better explain it. So that we found that very beneficial. Graphic organizers and anchor charts, this is just a way to visually represent what is being taught. So dividing decimals, we had a anchor chart illustrating how to divide long division so they could remember and look back on the anchor chart. And we found a lot of success in those also. And target and success criteria, as mentioned in the daily lesson plans, this creates a clear way for the students to know when they are successful at the end of the day. We don't want them waiting until the whole unit is over to know if they're successful. We want them to know if they're successful every day. And the target and success criteria provides that for the students. Overall, there is a 69% growth for these students, which is so awesome to celebrate. And a last strategy, I guess, to mention is the professional learning community. This helped us really look at the differentiation that is needed for our students that were scored high on the pre-assessment. We wanted to push them and having them continue learning, even if it might not be specific to the 5th grade unit that we're doing. that's why we push them to 6th grade math. And then also accommodations and modifications. This is either adjusting what the students are learning based on their level or their individualized learning plans, or how to adjust little things to make it more accessible for their learning without changing the standards.
Awesome. So we recognize that this comes as a huge project for us as student teachers in the field of education. It comes out to about 200 pages of research and analysis. But the thing that we also know is this is something that teachers do every day. It's something that teachers do in recognizing how can I help be a better teacher, in recognizing my children's growth, where they start and where they end. It's something you do whether it's every unit or every day. Overall, this is something that educators work together in being better at and helping each other with collectively as a community. So thank you so much for listening. We appreciate your time.